10 years on YouTube, baby! Yeah, I know I should have done this way earlier. Personal things happened. But hey, better late than never. For those who are new here, I'm Savvy Sage. Or you can just call me Sage, it's easier that way. In this episode, to celebrate 10 years of making videos on YouTube, we're going to take a look back to when I first started making videos on the platform. Not too long ago, I did an episode where I revisited my first online videos I made. However, that was back when I was self-hosting them on my website. At first, I made videos in standard definition, but as my videos increased in quality and I started editing them in HD, I ran into some storage problems. So I had no other choice but to join YouTube. I created my first YouTube channel on February 13th, 2015, which is now over a decade ago. Man, do I feel old. And for those wondering, yes, my first channel is still up. However, it now houses a side hobby of mine that I like to call Keenimation. Anyways, so what was the first video I ever uploaded to YouTube? Well, obviously you saw the title and that thing in front of you. It was about the Raspberry Pi. Now, for those of you who probably have no idea what I'm talking about, let me explain. The Raspberry Pi is a small, inexpensive single-board computer, originally developed by the UK non-profit Raspberry Pi Foundation. First introduced on February 29, 2012, the Raspberry Pi was initially targeted at education, but ultimately extended well beyond that, being used in hobbyist, robotics, server, automation, and even industrial markets. Because of this, the Raspberry Pi became an extremely popular choice in the tech-savvy world, and would span multiple generations over the years. You had the original Raspberry Pi Model B, the cheaper Model A, the Raspberry Pi 2, the Raspberry Pi Zero, the Raspberry Pi 3, the Raspberry Pi 4, the Pi 400, the Raspberry Pi Pico, the Pi Zero 2, the Pi 5, the Pi Pico 2, the Pi 500, and of course, the Raspberry Pi Monitor, which is what you're seeing right now. The Raspberry Pi was so successful, in fact, that in June of 2024, the for-profit subsidiary of the Raspberry Pi Foundation, Raspberry Pi Limited, went public in the stock market. Despite this concerning some people, the Raspberry Pi continues to be very popular, and are still putting out some pretty solid products. Considering I've been a happy customer of theirs for years, I might want to invest in a little Raspberry Pi stock. A little. As of 2025, almost 70 million Raspberry Pi units have been sold, with the majority of them coming from the industrial market. I can't say I'm surprised. They've certainly come a long way since their beginnings, and to this day, I still enjoy playing around with these computers, particularly to tinker around and experiment with as fun little Linux machines. I got a chance to meet some of the people who worked at Raspberry Pi at the 2025 Automate conference in Detroit, and I learned some new things that day, kind of similar to my experiences at Vintage Computer Festival Midwest. Now yes, I am aware that there are competitors such as the Banana Pi, the Orange Pi, the Odroid, the Genetech X Pi, and a multitude of pre-built mini PCs. While I am open to trying them out someday, the Raspberry Pi has continued to be my first pick when it comes to small single-board computers like this. The story behind how I got into Raspberry Pi all began at the beginning of 2015. I first heard about it through an event at a local church. It involved some wood-carved cars or something, and they used a Raspberry Pi to calculate the time and speed. I got pretty curious about the system and wanted to get one for myself. However, there was a problem. It wasn't sold at large retail chains like Best Buy, but rather at a much smaller retail chain called Micro Center, which is like Best Buy, but well, better. Micro Center has dozens of locations across the United States. However, they're not as big as something like Best Buy or Circuit City, before they went out of business. This results in a lot of scattered locations, but thankfully I happened to find one nearby. Anyways, once I heard about this Raspberry Pi computer being sold, at least physically, through Micro Center, we went over there and I ended up buying my first unit, the original. Now, according to one of the members of the team I talked to at Automate, my Raspberry Pi was among those manufactured at a Sony plant in Wales, while the first batch of Raspberry Pis were manufactured in China. You can tell the difference between the two simply by looking at the color of the headphone jack. So that's how I got my first Raspberry Pi. But with something like this, what do you do with it? You make a video on it, of course. Shortly after I created my first YouTube channel, I started filming my first YouTube video, where I showed people how to get started with the Raspberry Pi, in a video simply titled Raspberry Pi Quick Start Guide. Within a few days, it was finished and uploaded to YouTube on February 18th, 2015. So at this point, I've only explained the backstory of this video. But now I think it's about time that I actually show it to you. What you're about to see is over a decade old, and is about 8 minutes long. Unlike the last time where I revisited my past work, there's going to be no commentary on it until afterwards. So, without any further delay, this is my first YouTube video. Enjoy!
In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to get started with your Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi is a $35 mini computer which has been used in a variety of projects and is also used to experiment with. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to install Raspbian and how to get started with it. But let's take a moment to look at the guts and ports of the system. First off, you have is a 700 MHz ARM11 processor, which can be overclocked to 1 GHz. You also have 512 MB of onboard RAM and a Broadcom Video Core 4 GPU. The ports on this system consist of USB 2.0, 100 megabit per second Ethernet, HDMI, micro USB, GPIO for connecting to electronic circuitry, composite video, 3.5mm audio, 2 special connectors for connecting to a camera module, and lastly we have the LED activity lights for the power and the internet activity. Alright, so here are the requirements needed to set up your Raspberry Pi. First off you'll need is a computer monitor with an HDMI port. Now you can use an HDTV, but if you don't have one, you can just use a normal computer monitor with the use of an adapter, like this one. Or you can use the composite video port to connect to an old CRT TV, like this one. Next up on the list is a USB keyboard and mouse. Now you'll have to grab a spare one just for the Raspberry Pi. Alright, so next up on the list is a computer speaker. Now, the HDMI port will supply audio for you, but if you're using a computer monitor or an old TV, I highly recommend that you'll grab a spare computer speaker. For example, this cheap speaker branded as iHome. Now, this next one is optional, but I recommend it. You'll need an Ethernet cable to connect to the internet. Now, if you don't have one, you can buy one on the internet or a local store. Now, the Raspberry Pi does not come with built-in wireless, so if you want wireless 802.11, you'll need to buy a USB wireless dongle, like this one. Next up on the list is a micro USB power adapter, the same one used to charge your Android phone. Now, I recommend grabbing a spare one just for the Raspberry Pi. And then finally, we'll need an SD card that is at least 8 GB or more. Now, I recommend 8 GB because the software I'm going to be showing you requires at least 4 GB or more. So now we have everything needed for the Raspberry Pi setup. Now we're going to get on our computer and set up the Raspberry Pi's SD card. So first, plug in the SD card into your computer. It should pop up directly on your desktop if you're using a Mac. If you're using Windows, go to My Computer and it should pop up as removable media. Now we want to format the SD card, so we're going to have to download some free software called SD Formatter. You can find a link in the description below, or you could just Google for it. Download and install the latest version of the software. Now, if you're using a Mac, it should ask you for your administrator's password. If you're using Windows, it should ask you if you want to open the program or not. We want to select Quick Format as the format option, and we could just leave the name of the SD card alone. Just click Format, and it should format the SD card. The next thing we're going to install is New Out-of-the-Box Software, or NOOBS for short. This is the recommended software used for the Raspberry Pi. You can download the latest version of NOOBS. The link is in the description. Once it's done downloading, extract the file using a free file archiver. Once it's done extracting, drag all the contents from the NOOBS folder into your SD card. Once it finishes copying the files, you can safely remove the SD card and then you can eject it out of the computer. So now it's time to set up a Raspberry Pi, but first I need to set up the computer monitor and plug it in. Now to set up the Raspberry Pi itself. First I'm going to insert in the SD card on the bottom of the system, and then I'm going to set up the keyboard and mouse. Now, you can plug it in directly into the Raspberry Pi, but I'm going to be plugging it in through the monitor. Not only does this monitor act like a normal computer monitor, but it also acts as a USB hub. So I can plug in the keyboard and mouse directly into the monitor. So now we'll be setting up the video. I'm going to be using the HDMI cable and the HDMI to DVI adapter. I'm just going to plug in the DVI port into the monitor, and then I'll plug in the HDMI into the Raspberry Pi. Now we'll set up the computer speaker. I'll plug it in and then I'll set it directly in the center of the monitor stand. Then I'll plug in the USB and the audio jack from the speaker to the Raspberry Pi. We're almost done. We're going to plug in the Ethernet cable to connect to the internet. And then finally, we'll set up our micro USB power adapter. Upon plugging in the micro USB into the Raspberry Pi, it will start up. Now you should see a screen that looks like this upon boot. Once it finishes preparations, you should see a list of operating systems ranging from OpenELEC to Pidora and RISC-OS. But for this tutorial, we're going to be selecting the Raspbian OS. Just click the checkbox, click Install, and then click Yes to confirm installation. Now this process will take a pretty long time, so why don't you go ahead and have a slice of Raspberry Pi while you're at it. So once it finishes installing, click OK and it should reboot you into the Raspbian OS. Now you should see the Raspberry Pi configuration utility, so we're going to change the internationalization. Just go to internationalization options and I'm going to change the language. So I'll select en_us.utf-8 and that will change it to English. Now I'm going to change the time zone just for this occasion because I want to keep the time and date accurate. And then finally we'll change the keyboard layout. I'm going to select the default keyboard layout, which is the 105 key keyboard, and I'm going to change the keyboard layout's language to English US. And then I'm going to ignore all these other settings and stuff. Now this is optional, you don't have to do it, but I'm going to overclock the system at 800 megahertz. It is safe to do it, but if you want to go higher than that, you'll need a proper cooling set. Okay, so to finish, hit tab twice, press enter, and if it asks you to reboot, press enter again. If not, type in sudo reboot in the command line interface. Now once it restarts, it's going to ask you to log in, so the default username for the Raspbian OS is Pi, and the default password is Raspberry, and you can change it later. Now you're pretty much done, but if you want to use this as a mini computer, just type in this command, start X, and that will start you up into the graphical user interface, and you can use it as a little mini computer if you want to. So that's pretty much it for this video on the quick start guide to the Raspberry Pi. Please like and subscribe, and for more SoC content, go to my website at www.sagefun.com.
So there you have it, my first YouTube video. Okay, it wasn't much, but hey, it was a start. Much like my earlier work, this video was filmed with one of my first cameras I ever owned, the Canon PowerShot ELPH110HS, and the video quality was, in hindsight, not very good. But there was a reason for that, because I recorded the initial footage in 480p or VGA quality. Now, the camera does support HD video up to 1080p. However, much like my DSLR camera that I use for filming my shots in my studio, there is a recording time limit per clip. In the case of my Canon camera, you can only record up to 10 minutes of HD video per clip. However, there is no time limit per clip if you record in standard definition. Also, while I'm on the topic of Canon, they did have a booth at Automate 2025. Just thought it was worth bringing up. Along with that, the entire video and voiceovers were recorded without a script. No, seriously, I mostly improvised all of this. I had maybe a couple notes here and there, but aside from that, a lot of it was impromptu, kind of like my insider video logs on YouTube and Patreon. And like many of my videos back then, they were all edited in iMovie, which was fitting for something basic like this. So now let's take a look at some of the little tidbits on the Pi that were brought up in that video. As mentioned before, the first Raspberry Pi had an ARM11 processor core, 512 megabytes of RAM, and a built-in GPU, all combined into a single system-on-a-chip made by Broadcom, the BCM2835. The ARM11 core uses the ARM v6 architecture, which dates back to 2002. While ARM v6 is compatible with plenty of software, it notably isn't compatible with more popular operating systems like Ubuntu or Windows, so you're only limited to stuff like Debian, Kodi, and RISC-OS, among others. Aside from the first generation Raspberry Pi and Pi Zero, the ARM11 core was also used on the Nintendo 3DS, as well as the second generation iPhone, the iPhone 3G. Also, as brought up before, the first Raspberry Pi had no built-in Wi-Fi, so a dongle is required to get wireless internet out of this thing. It wasn't until the Raspberry Pi 3 came around that built-in Wi-Fi was added. And then you've got NOOBS. First introduced in 2013, NOOBS, or New Out-of-Box Software, was meant to make it easy to install Linux on your Raspberry Pi without having to use disk imaging tools, and it also acted as a bootloader, so you can load more than one operating system on it, should you choose to. As of 2022, NOOBS is no longer in active development, and it has since been replaced by the Raspberry Pi Imager program. However, if you're still interested in a multi-OS configuration, there are thankfully alternatives, such as Pin and BerryBoot. The version of NOOBS showcased in the video was the one that was compatible with the then newly released Raspberry Pi 2, and many of the distros featured have since seen plenty of changes. Raspbian, a portmanteau of Raspberry Pi and Debian, is now called Raspberry Pi OS, and continues to be available for download on the official Raspberry Pi website. It also has since gotten a version for x86 PCs, in case you like to run it without having to commit to buying a Raspberry Pi. Initially, Raspbian started up with a text-only setup configuration. However, with the current versions, it has switched to a graphical setup assistant, thus making it far more user-friendly. OpenELEC, or Open Embedded Linux Entertainment Center, a Linux distro based on Kodi, formerly XBMC, was forked in March of 2016 due to creative differences, and its final update would be released in 2017. Most of its developers moved on to the LibreELEC project, which is still going to this day. Sadly, the latest version of LibreELEC is not compatible with the Pi 1 nor the original Zero, requiring at least a Raspberry Pi 2 or higher to get the latest features. However, the last compatible version for the first Pi, version 2020.11, is still available for download as of the making of this episode. Arch Linux ARM is still around today. However, as of 2022, it no longer supports the ARM v6 architecture, which includes the original Raspberry Pi. RaspBMC, another Linux distro based on XBMC, was later superseded by OSMC, or Open Source Media Center, just a few months after I released my first video. It has since been ported to other platforms outside of the Raspberry Pi, such as the first generation Apple TV and OSMC's own Vero hardware. However, much like LibreELEC, the latest version of OSMC does not support the original Pi hardware anymore. However, you can still download the 2020.11 version on their website. Also, that 404 page, I feel like it's symbolic for something that I can't wrap my mind around. Pidora, originally built as a port of Fedora Remix for ARM v6, hasn't been in active development since 2014, as Fedora now officially supports the Raspberry Pi, beginning with the second generation. Finally, there's RISC-OS, which is still around to this day and is very much in active development. So out of all the operating systems listed in my legacy video, RISC-OS remains the only one that remains unchanged. For now anyways. But those are nowhere near as important as the biggest mistake I made with this video. And I know a lot of you are already screaming at me for it. I refer to the touchscreen display connector as a connector for the camera module. When I first did this video, I just assumed that because both of these connectors looked identical, that they would work with the camera module, not knowing that they are not the same internally. This aforementioned connector on the right is for an optional touchscreen display, while the connector on the left is for the camera module. This is why it's extremely important to research before you start filming, and I didn't bother in this case. So, to make up for the sins of the past, I decided to purchase a Raspberry Pi touchscreen that I have not used since I bought it years ago. And I'm going to build a computer that has a built-in touchscreen. For this project, I'm going with my rarely used Raspberry Pi 3, along with a case designed for it. So, why not start now? Okay, so the Raspberry Pi has now been touchscreenified, if you can call it that. Yeah, I've held off this for a few years, but finally, I've done it. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning about this case is that it does have a little slot for the Raspberry Pi camera, but I don't have that set up right now. Also, you'll notice there's two micro USB. One does power the Raspberry Pi and the touchscreen. I think both of them do. This should be able to power both the touchscreen and the Raspberry Pi thanks to the GPIO pins that I showed you before. But yeah, so what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and boot it right up. Now, I did put a micro SD card inside of this Pi 3. I had to install Raspberry Pi OS, a fresh installation, and I used Raspberry Pi Imager to get it onto the card. And one blue screen later, and several minutes worth of updates later, the operating system should be bootable on this thing. So, without any further delay, I've got the power cord already hooked up right here. Let's go ahead and power this thing on. This is the first time I'm powering it on, so wish me luck here. I gotta make sure it's in the right place. Oh, I have it the wrong way. Yeah, I had it the wrong way. There we go. Nah, just kidding. It didn't blow up. But for some reason, it is upside down. I hope I didn't install the screen the wrong way. Huh. But yeah, it looks like it does work, and yes, it did boot right to the screen, but for some reason it's upside down. Let's see if the touch screen works. Yep, it does. So I can use the thing, technically. Maybe I just have to rotate it or something. Here, let me go ahead and rotate it real quick. Let's go to Preferences, Screen Configuration. But yeah, it does work. Let's see, there's our screen. All right, Orientation. Inverted. Apply. Yep, there we go. So now it should be the right screen orientation. But there you go. So, yep, now we have a fully functional touchscreen on the Raspberry Pi and in the proper orientation. Let me get the cable out of the way here. So let's explore a little bit of it. I don't have a lot of time, but let's take a look at it. It is in a much smaller resolution compared to using a Raspberry Pi monitor, but like I said, it does work. We can actually navigate around here, and it does have a built-in keyboard also, if you tap on it. There's the keyboard. This is bundled with the latest versions of Raspberry Pi OS. Normally, you would have to install it manually, at least according to the Element 14 instructions. But that's only on older versions of the software. The newer versions have the built-in keyboard, so you can actually type something in if you want. So let's go ahead and let's go to connect to the internet here, since this is wireless prepared, thankfully. Trying to load up the browser here. Oh, there we go. Looks like I loaded two of them up. I don't want to do that. And there we go. Yep, it is running. Let's max out the window. There we go. Yep, there's the Raspberry Pi website. Oh, I got a low voltage warning. Haha. Okay, I have like way too many windows open. Let me... This is supposed to work with my power supply, right? Let's look at the power information real quick, if I can. It's not letting me for some reason. Oh, there we go. Oh my gosh. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's see if I can scroll down here. What is going on? Yeah, I am definitely using the right power supply. 5 volts, 2.5 amps, but I still get a low voltage warning for whatever reason. Well, it does work, and that's really all that matters. So, oh yeah, turn on camera, no thank you. So yeah, it does work. It just needs a little bit time to get used to, minus the power supply, but that's probably a Raspberry Pi 3 thing. Now, I also do have a case for the Raspberry Pi 4, and the touch display should work with it. I believe it uses the same connector, but that would require me having to take apart the whole thing and reassembling it. But for now anyways, yeah, this does work. As you can see, when it does work, it works pretty well. And I can select from different menus right there. So, yep. I would call this one a success. It just needs a different Raspberry Pi machine to go in there. But for first timer, it works fine. Okay, so quick update. I just switched out the hardware here. Instead of a Raspberry Pi 3, I now have a Raspberry Pi 4, as you can see right there. And it also has I also have a case for it as well, which I'm glad I bought. But yeah, here it is. I didn't get any footage of it, unfortunately, of this swap, so sorry about that. But yeah, looks much nicer, much sleeker. I personally like this a little more. But the real question is, will it perform better? And the answer is yes. That's much faster compared to the last Pi, and I'm not getting the low power warning anymore because I'm using a much higher wattage power supply that is compatible with the Pi 4. It's USB-C, so there's that. We should be able to run, and yes, I went to jackbox.tv earlier during the test, but yeah, it does work much nicer than it did before. Scrolls a lot nicer too. Put it into dark mode because I like that better. But yeah, so works much nicer than it did before, and yeah, performs a lot better too. So yep, even some basic tasks work fine. Even the keyboard pops up quicker. So yeah, performs much nicer. I'd say go with the Pi 4 if you want to use the touchscreen with it, and that's the latest one that will support this particular one because the Pi 5 uses a different connector, and yeah, it won't work. But Pi 4, perfectly fine. So, how do you like them apples? Or in this case, raspberries. Either works. About a week after I finished that video, I decided to start work on a follow-up, where I showed viewers how to install a Linux distribution outside of NOOBS, using some third-party software. The video, titled Installing Linux Without NOOBS, was finished and uploaded on March 1st, 2015. This was my second video I ever made for YouTube, and it's much shorter compared to the first, at around 6 minutes. So, just like with my previous video, what you're about to see is the whole thing, completely uncut. And like before, I'll provide commentary at the end, which won't be much. But for now, here is my second YouTube video. Enjoy!
In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to install a Raspberry Pi operating system without using NOOBS. Now, if you hadn't done this yet, I recommend watching the Quick Start Guide video before watching this video. You can find the video in the description, or you can just click on the video right here. Alright, let's get started with this tutorial. Now, if you already have an operating system installed on the SD card, reformat your SD card because we're going to be installing another Raspberry Pi operating system. Okay, so plug in your SD card into your computer and it should pop up on your Mac. If you're on Windows, go to My Computer and it should pop up as removable media. Now, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to go to downloads.raspberrypi.org. This is the same website where we went to download NOOBS. Now, we don't want to select NOOBS, we want to select these operating systems. We can select OpenELEC, we can select RaspBMC, we can also select Raspbian, etc. But for this tutorial, I'm going to be using Pidora, which is a port of Fedora Remix for the Raspberry Pi. So go ahead and download the latest version of that operating system, any operating system, or you can download the latest version of Pidora. And once it finishes downloading, extract the file, and upon extracting the file, you should see that the operating system is in an IMG. Now, you might be tempted to just open the IMG file and drag all the contents, but that's not really the smart way to do it. So, I'm going to be showing you a better way. So, if you're using a Mac, you're going to have to download a free program called Apple Pi Baker. The latest version is version 1.6, but I'm going to be installing 1.5, which is the non-sudo version. This is the version that doesn't require a root password. So just download that and open up the application, and you should see a screen that looks like this. So select your SD card from the list and then click the button that says IMG to SD card. Now select the IMG that you just downloaded. Now it might ask you for your password, so type in your administrator password. Now later on it might ask you for your password again, so type that in as well. And when it's through, go ahead and click OK and close out the application. Safely remove the SD card and then finally eject the SD card. Now you can do the same thing in Windows using a free application called Win32 Disk Imager. I won't show you it, but I'll link it in the description. Now, as you can see, the Raspberry Pi setup has been cleaned up, so it's much nicer now. So what you want to do next is you want to hook up your Raspberry Pi. So hook up your computer monitor or TV, hook up your keyboard and mouse or USB hub, hook up your Ethernet cable, and also don't forget to hook up your SD card along with the computer speaker. And once you're done, go ahead and turn on your computer monitor and then plug in your Raspberry Pi. Now, it should boot straight into the operating system, as you can see. And so you're pretty much done, but for people who are installing Pidora, I'll show you how to set up Pidora. So upon first boot of Pidora, you should see this setup assistant screen. So just click the forward button and just click forward to accept the license agreement, and click forward again. The keyboard layout the default keyboard layout is US English. Next, you'll need to create a user password. You can type in the username and the password of your Pidora operating system. You also want to type in your root password. Okay, so the next thing you should do is set up your time zone for Pidora. And another thing you should also do is set the file system settings. Just set it to default and click forward. Now, you should be able to get to the system settings screen. You can change the host name of your Pidora Raspberry Pi host, or you can change the boot type to a text mode interface, or you could just leave it at graphical. Now, the next part of the system settings is called video configuration. Now, this is the part where it might get a little confusing. Now, if you're using an HDMI TV, select HDMI only, no overscan. If you're using a computer monitor that uses a DVI adapter, make sure you check off using a DVI adapter so it knows that you're using a computer monitor, like an HDMI to DVI adapter. Now, if you're using an old TV that is in NTSC using composite, select HDMI default NTSC North American, and basically that will set it to NTSC format for old US CRT TVs. So when you're through with the system settings, click finish, and it should boot you straight back into the Pidora operating system. And you should also be able to see the login screen. So type in your password for your username, and you should be able to see this window that says welcome to your first star of the panel. Just click on use default config and you should be booted straight to the desktop. So that is how you set up Pidora on the Raspberry Pi if you plan to set up Pidora. So have fun experimenting with the Raspberry Pi operating system. So thank you for watching this video. Please leave a like and subscribe, and for more SoC content, go to my website at www.sagefun.com.
And that's all he wrote. I hope you enjoyed this little time travel journey with me. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind here. One is the website downloads.raspberrypi.org. You could still download the latest and legacy versions of Raspberry Pi OS and NOOBS from there. Or you can download the legacy versions of OpenELEC, RaspBMC, Arch Linux, and even Pidora from there. And speaking of which, as mentioned before, Pidora is now defunct due to Fedora officially supporting the Raspberry Pi, beginning with the system's second iteration. Lastly, the traditional method of using third-party tools such as Apple Pi Baker and Win32 Disk Imager have largely been replaced with the aforementioned imager that the Raspberry Pi organization now recommends. However, you can still use both tools if you'd like, which are still available for download. Or you can use other alternatives like Rufus. So there you have it, my first 2 YouTube videos. I've come a long way from those days, and I've certainly gotten better since then. These videos were made at a time when I just created them as a hobby. I never would have thought that they would take me to where I am today, but now, over a decade later, here we are. So thank you, Raspberry Pi, for all the great memories. But more importantly, thank you all so much for sticking with me throughout the past 10 years on YouTube. Here's to another 10. As always, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you look forward to what I've got cooking in the future. For now, though, I will see you all next time. Take care.